welcome back. Well, the politicians have just 2 more days of what's certain to be hard campaigning in which to win the voters' hearts and minds. This morning's opinion polls suggest, as many others do, a hung parliament, with Labour holding the majority of seats. With me here to discuss these latest verdicts on how the parties are performing are Tony Banks for Labour here in our studio, and in Westminster, Richard Tracey for the Conservatives. Lord Holme for the Liberal Democrats, we're hoping might join us if he manages to get on his bike and zoom his way into the studio in time. In the meantime, Richard Tracey, why spend the last 2 days of the campaign talking about a hung parliament and the dangers of a hung parliament if you're so sure you're going to win?
Well, we're not talking about a hung parliament because despite what your poll is saying, what we're finding in the marginal seats, and it's those, of course, that will decide the election, is that we're getting a very good reception on the doorstep, and our candidates are very confident that they're going to come through. Indeed, in London, which of course is the area I know best, we're even believing that we're going to take some seats off Labour.
Richard Tracey, I mean, you might well say that, but Mr Major, Mr Patton, Douglas Hurd, Kenneth Baker spent the entire day yesterday talking about the dangers of a hung parliament. In the Daily Telegraph this morning, Baker raises the fear of pact with devil. That hardly sounds like somebody talking about ending up with a large majority in Parliament.
Well, I think it is a danger, and it's right to warn the public of it, because there's no doubt still on the doorstep we're finding people who haven't made up their mind. As I say, we are getting a very good reception for Conservative candidates, but there are people who still say that they don't know. And I think that the important thing in these last 2 days is that we must tell the public that they have got to focus their minds. They've got to look at the awful prospect of a Labour government or a Lib-Lab pact, and many people will still remember the Lib-Lab pact of 78, 79. They've got to focus on this, or the alternative of a Conservative government, which will mean more enterprise, lower taxation, and British industry able to go forward, as the leaders of British industry have been telling people. This is the important thing.
Tony Banks, are you personally in favour of introducing a system of proportional representation in this country?
Well, we've actually had Professor Plant looking at different systems for something like the last 2 years. I thought it was a bit much for the Liberals and the commentators to suggest that the only reason that the Labour Party and Neil Kinnock was talking about the way we govern our country as being brought about because of Liberal pressure. I mean, I think it's right for any radical party, which the Labour Party is, for any radical party to be looking at the way we govern ourselves without, at this stage, talking about a particular system or deals with anyone, because, you know, like Richard Tracey, the Labour Party is saying quite clearly that we're not going into this election to try and achieve a hung parliament. If that's what the electorate deliver, well, the politicians will have to then come to terms with it. But we're in there for a majority Labour government, and we're on the line to get that.
Isn't it a leader's job to lead his party?
Well, I think that's a fairly non-contentious statement. Yes, try another one.
If you'd agree with that, then wouldn't you agree that on an issue as important as proportional representation, Neil Kinnock should come clean and say what he believes in?
No, because, you see, you don't, in the sort of hothouse of an election campaign, start talking about the systems of government as such. I mean, these are matters that will require calculated, considered thought out of the somewhat hysterical period of a general election campaign. And certainly it isn't the sort of thing that you chuck into interviews with journalists or start talking about deals in dark rooms. This is something that the whole country's got to talk about outside of an election campaign. Maybe, who knows, with a referendum at the end of it, because this is far too significant to be sort of a bartering deal during the course of a general election campaign.
Richard Holme, who's joined us, I hope, in Millbank in the studio.
Morning.
Just because people in this country aren't prepared, as it seems at the moment, to give one party enough for an overall majority, it doesn't mean they're actually voting for a hung parliament, does it?
No, I don't think there's any way in our electoral system that you can vote for a particular outcome. And as far as I can ascertain, the main thing that's happening is that neither party seems likely to get an overall majority at the election. And that's the decision of the electorate. They can't vote for a hung parliament, but that's what all the polls show they're going to get.
But it's something that you'd like to see, isn't it?
Well, I think it does offer a very good prospect of changing our constitution for the better. I thought it was disgraceful yesterday when Mr Baker talked about pacts with the devil. That's the language of hysteria. I thought it was equally inappropriate for the Prime Minister of this country to be talking about perverting the Constitution. And if I might just say to Tony Banks, I'm delighted the Labour Party and I was thinking about this, but in 1927 the Labour shadow cabinet was supporting proportional representation, so they've had quite a long time to think about it.
And who actually opposed it in Parliament at the time? It was the Liberals who actually opposed it.
I think this is ancient history, gentlemen.
Maybe
To
so,
talk
but
about
the point is the Liberals always wanted to be in a position of brokering. The Liberals always talk about proportional representation because it's self-seeking, it's vested interest. When one of the major parties, like the Labour Party, talk about it, then you know it's because we're committed to democracy, not just trying to serve our own narrow party interests.
So you're guaranteeing that if you do not have an overall majority in Parliament that you would not talk about proportional representation because at that point you say it's not in your interest to do so?
No, that's the complete opposite of what I just said. What I said is that because we're prepared to talk about it, it shows that we are primarily concerned about the structure of government and democracy, because it could very well be argued that, you know, that we, one of the big parties along with the Tories, stand the most to lose in terms of seats. That's the important point. But we're prepared to look at it because it's in the interests of democracy. That just shows you that we're not trying to serve our own narrow party interests, which the Liberals are doing.
Tony Banks, you sound like you're in favour of it.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm one of those, look, I'm a punter. I mean, I'm one of those that want to see what's on offer, because I actually think that our present system clearly is not fair, it's not just, it's not equitable. It produces governments like Mrs. Thatcher's government that can't speak on behalf of the majority of the people.
Richard Holme, you sound like you have a sympathiser in here.
I think he's in favour, but one thing I think we should all stop doing, all three of us, and that's stop talking about majority parties and minority parties. It looks to me as though the Conservative and Labour Party will both get, what, 36, 37, 38% of the votes, as though we'll get 22, 23%. We're all minority parties, and we've all got to come to terms with that.
Richard Tracey, speaking to us from the studio as well. Douglas Hurd rubbished small minority parties yesterday. He said they were an odd lot. Would you say the same of the Ulster Unionists, for example?
Well, can I first of all deal with this haggle that's been going on between Richard Holme and Tony Banks? I think that just illustrates the dangers of the backdoor deals, the kind of haggling in smoke-filled rooms which the public would be delivering this country into if indeed we did finish up with the hung parliament. We've had this situation in, I think, 1927, 1929, 1974 and 1977, when the Liberals have been in this kind of position of sort of power brokering with the Labour Party. And in fact, in 1978-79, when the Lib-Lab Pact was there, the two of them managed to deliver cuts in defence, cuts in health and longer waiting lists for the hospitals, and cuts in education. Now, faced with that sort of prospect, the public certainly don't want it. I do believe that it's right for the Conservative Party leadership to be saying that the best thing for the country would be a clear result. And at the moment, as I said at the beginning, we do believe that we're on course for a clear result for the Conservative Party, because we are doing extremely well in the marginal seats, which will decide this election.
The latest poll in the marginal seats show that there's a 7% swing from your party to the Labour Party. It shows completely the opposite.
Well, the news I've heard this morning is that was particularly in London, but of course,
it's across the country, it's not in London.
No, I believe there was a London poll across 31 marginals. Now, this apparently is an aggregated poll. And if you aggregate all the figures together from the interviews, you will get, obviously, some balancing from very strong Labour seats and from very strong Conservative seats. But our target marginals in the capital city show that we are certainly in front, and our candidates are very confident that they're going to come through to victory. And as I said at the beginning, we do seriously believe that there are one or two seats particularly where we are going to take the power from the Labour Party.
Richard, you're bound to say that. You're bound to say that. I mean, you ask any candidate what's going to happen, and they're going to say it's going well on the doorstep. The fact is that huge ICM poll shows us almost there in terms of achieving an overall Labour lead. And that's a fantastic result given the mountain we had to climb. face it, Richard, you're up shit creek, man, and that's where you're going to stay.
Well,
I think we better keep the
even
language,
if you were
if
to
not the
believe
tone
the
of the
polls,
debate.
that is a great warning for the public. If you're to believe the polls, if we really are
What
heading
else
for a
can we
hung
believe?
parliament,
I think
we're
we better...
heading-
Believe the
we're heading
polls.
for
Gentlemen,
trouble.
I'm
Yes,
going to have to
downfall.
play speaker here. Order, order. Thank you very much for joining us at any rate. Tony Banks, Richard Holme and Richard Tracey. Thank you, gentlemen. 6:48.